I am thrilled to be here today with Mike Romano, who is a veteran DOJ prosecutor. He was a prosecutor with the department for 18 years, and he spent some of those years prosecuting January 6th rioters. And he, in fact, was the deputy of the Capitol Siege section. So thank you, Mike, for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And the reason we wanted to have you today is because we want to discuss recent charges brought against a January 6th rioter who had been convicted and pardoned by President Trump. His name is Christopher Moahan. And Christopher Moahan was arrested this past Sunday for allegedly threatening to assassinate House Minority Leader Rep Jeffries. So we thought that you would be a great person to talk to about this. Um, so, you know, it's not surprising that letting out violent criminals, that pardoning violent criminals would embolden them to commit more violence or to threaten more violence, in this case, political violence, allegedly. Can you walk us through this? Can you walk us through the Moynihan case and generally what the consequences of pardoning violent criminals is and has been and will continue to be?
Sure. The Christopher Moahan case arising from January 6th involved him invading the building and invading the Senate chamber. He lined up on the east side of the building, was among the group of rioters who breached the police lines on the east side. He stood outside the door on the east side of the building which led to the rotunda. And there he would have seen rioters fight with police officers to gain access to the building, basically. When a rioter opened the doors from the inside, he was one of the people who made his way in. He went to the Senate chamber. He was among people who were rifling through senators' desks. He's caught on camera saying words to the effect of, there's got to be something in here that we can use against those senators, trying to find incriminating documents or incriminating information, as if the senators were doing something wrong by voting on the certification of the presidential election. And when he was in the Senate chamber, he would have seen other rioters who were in the Senate chamber basically armed as if to hold it down and to restrain people should senators have been there. There were people in the Senate chamber with tactical vests, zip ties, other things that make clear that their motivation was to restrain, possibly injure, possibly harm the members of Congress and senators. So that's the gist of what he was convicted for. He was charged with obstruction of Congress, which is the statute that the Supreme Court later limited, as well as 5 other charges relating to trespassing in the building, trespassing in Congress, disorderly and disruptive conduct, that sort of thing.
So, it seems pretty clear that the individuals who were pardoned or who were convicted had a predilection for violence. Wouldn't you agree? And in fact, violence on that day was premeditated, wasn't it?
I think for a lot of people it was. There are some people who I think were perhaps caught up in the mob mentality that day, but there were certainly the travel to D.C. and the efforts to storm the Capitol were premeditated. We saw that in lots of communications for lots of rioters that they were discussing not just coming to D.C. to appear at a rally or participate in legitimate protests, but to storm Congress. And so there's certainly an element of premeditation there. Mr. Moynihan had a criminal record before he came to D.C. He had several criminal convictions in his past. There were certainly other rioters who did. And, the way that the behavior tracks with the planning can be seen throughout these cases. To the point about the pardons emboldening people, these were crimes that folks committed out of ideology. They were committing these crimes in support of President Trump. They were committing these crimes to try to retain him in power. They were motivated to commit these crimes by ideology. It was reinforced by the groups that they were part of, the people who they were communicating with. And what I saw watching them on video is they saw themselves as heroes. They saw themselves as revolutionaries. And the pardons reinforced that idea that they were doing something right and noble. And also that the president has their back, right? The consequences for what they did are going to be wiped away. So if something happens and they do other violence or commit other crimes in service of their ideology, they're going to be emboldened to do it. They're going to feel like somebody has their back.
So I think it's fair to say that it wasn't a day of love, as presidential leaders have characterized it.
I don't know anyone who could watch any of the footage and call it that unless they were lying.
And we all saw footage of it, but as a prosecutor, you saw a lot more footage than the public did, right?
Yes, I watched some footage from January 6th, probably almost every day of the 4 years I worked on the team, and from a lot of different angles. I mean, there were a variety of crimes committed all over the building. There was a lot going on. Different people's paths through the building were different. What any one rioter saw or interacted with would have varied greatly from what another rioter saw or interacted with. So there was actually a lot to unpack, even for people who know the day pretty well.
So, despite the violence that we all saw and that you saw even more of, um, what was it like for you as somebody who had prosecuted many of these people on the day that the president pardoned all of them? And he pardoned all 1,500 approximately, right?
He pardoned almost everybody. There were a few people whose sentences he commuted, but yes, he pardoned otherwise 1,500 plus people. Um, it was incredibly demoralizing. People had worked hard on these cases. I had, my colleagues had, FBI agents had, folks around the country. I mean, this was something that a lot of people saw, right? The riots were captured on national news. The rioters were proud of their conduct. They filmed themselves. They broadcast what they had done live as it was happening. And it was clear that people had committed crimes. I mean, there was no real question about that. There's no real defense to it other than to lie about what happened, to falsely call it a day of love or something like that. So to see all of that wiped away in an instant is really terrible. It's hard to underscore how awful it is to just see something that was uh, unjust, lied about, and ignored.
Um, you know, after the blanket pardon, the president didn't stop there. DOJ went ahead and fired a number of the DOJ prosecutors who prosecuted this case and the FBI agents who investigated these cases. Um, they were just doing their jobs, weren't they? You were assigned these cases, right? You didn't jump forward and volunteer to go after the people who committed violence on that day. Isn't that right? I mean, can you kind of describe how prosecutors do their jobs, like how assignments are made? It's
Sure.
not that people who were on the president's side or not on the president's side would volunteer for particular cases. Can you just kind of go through the process of how prosecutors and FBI agents and others take on the cases they take on?
Sure. FBI agents are largely assigned to cases they take on. They don't have discretion to, take on cases or not. Certainly as they're investigating something and learn about criminal conduct, they might broaden their investigation. They might make decisions, but they don't generally get to pick and choose what they're assigned to do. A lot of prosecutors don't either. My experience working at different offices in DOJ is that when I was not a manager, but on the line, I would get assigned to work on cases. If we had, a case that got charged, if we had a case that needed support, I would be given assignments. I didn't get to pick and choose those assignments. January 6th was a little bit different because some of the staffing required people from other offices to join the U.S. Attorney's office's effort to prosecute the riot. So there were a lot of people internal who were assigned to do that work, but they put out a call to people outside to go on loan to the U.S. Attorney's office, basically.
It was large. prosecutorial effort in DOJ's history,
Right,
wasn't it? Right.
right. And
There
the
were
sorts of
people in that particular office to handle all of the cases. So they brought in other people from different offices throughout the department. Isn't
exactly. Yeah, that's
and
exactly. They brought in people from elsewhere, and so people did, in that sense, volunteer for it. They had to express interest to their managers to do this work. They were allowed to do it if their offices could support it, if their offices had the ability to lose a person for a period of time to give that person over to this work. That sort of thing is pretty common in DOJ too. There's never been an effort like this. There's never been an effort of this size, but I've definitely had friends and coworkers who have gone on short-term assignments somewhere else for 6 months, a year, 2 years. I'm sure you have too. That's pretty common in DOJ. And one thing I would emphasize is that there was nothing political about any of the decisions we made at any point. The effort to start prosecuting the rioters began at the tail end of the Trump administration, while we had Republican Attorney General, Republican head of the U.S. Attorney's Office. These were people who were appointed by Trump, who saw the crimes that the rioters committed, same as the rest of us. Once Democratic leadership was in place after the election, they worked with us to get us the support we needed, the personnel we needed, the resources we needed to work on these cases, but they didn't drive the cases. They didn't make the decisions. The career prosecutors like me and my coworkers made decisions about who to charge, when to charge them, what to charge them with. We did that based on looking at the evidence. We did that the same way we would do it for any other case.
um, one of the prosecutors who was involved in those cases was now Judge Emil Bovee, isn't that right? When he was a prosecutor at Justice,
Yes, when he worked in New York, he was involved with the January 6th prosecutions.
and he did that because it was part of his job, right?
Right.
And you probably knew most of the prosecutors handling these cases, right?
Not necessarily in the different offices. I would say I knew all the ones in DC. I didn't interact with Emil at all when he was.
The pros, you knew most of the prosecutors handling these cases were in DC, so they would have been in their office working with you.
Right. We would often work with people in other districts to plan arrests for people, to work with people on making something happen wherever the defendant was based. And then in the early days, I think there were questions about who was going to be prosecuted where. So he might have had some of the cases when we were still sorting all that out.
Okay. And your colleagues in DC who you worked with every day, they weren't there because they were ideologues, right? They were there, they were doing their jobs because they were
Right.
these cases and they handled them, right?
Right. They were there because they were doing their jobs. They were employed at the U.S. Attorney's Office beforehand. If they were prosecuting federal crimes like, robberies across state lines, or trafficking in drugs, or trafficking people, any kind of that sort of case, like, they would have been doing that beforehand. They would have maybe come to the January 6th cases because they were assigned to do that, and then gone back to what they were doing. The DC U.S. Attorney's Office also handles local crimes like violent crimes, burglaries, shootings, homicide, the sort of things that you think about a DA's office handling. There were people there who because we needed resources, we needed people, would have gone from working on a homicide case to picking up a couple of January 6th cases, working those, going back to doing their homicide caseload.
And the conviction rate was pretty remarkable, wasn't it?
Yes. All but two people were convicted, I believe. There were two people who were acquitted, one at a trial, one at a sort of shortened trial-like process, but 1,000 plus people were convicted.
And, I think most people understand how convictions happen, but just to, emphasize this point, they were convicted by juries, right? They weren't convicted by political appointees from the Trump 1 administration or the Biden administration. They were all convicted by juries of the defendant's peers, right?
Mostly, yes. So there were some cases before judges. Most cases were before juries. There is no jury that acquitted any January 6th defendants. All of the cases that went to trial before juries resulted in convictions of every defendant. There might be some charges here and there that a jury acquitted on, but every defendant to be tried by a jury was convicted. Some defendants waived their right to be tried by juries and were tried by judges instead. Those were cases where it was the defendant's choice to do so. Sometimes you might think that a defendant would choose to do that if they think they have some sort of legal defense that maybe a judge would understand better than a jury does. And when a defendant wanted to have a judge try their case, we wouldn't oppose it. We trust the judges in D.C. to look at the law, look at the facts, and get it right. And these cases went to trial before judges who were appointed by Republican presidents, Democratic presidents, judges who were appointed by Donald Trump. And I think uniformly, they all saw the riot the same way. They all judged the cases fairly based on the evidence. And judges of all political backgrounds convicted the rioters based on the evidence they saw.
And you resigned your job during this administration, but a lot of your former colleagues were fired and otherwise targeted, demoted. They've been doxxed. They've been targeted by administration officials and members of the public. What has it been like to watch this happen to your former colleagues?
It's been hard. It's been hard to see the way that they've been treated. I think one of the things that we all understood as part of signing up for government service was that we were all bought into the mission. We'd all expect to be treated fairly by the government that we worked for. We expect a certain amount of respect for the work that we do. And some of my colleagues were fired for no reason, for plainly pretextual reasons, or on the idea that they're sort of, hidden deep state actors, right? That like these people can't be trusted to implement the president's agenda. Before this administration took power, I'd never heard any prior DOJ talk about implementing the president's agenda. It's just not something we did. In my work for almost 18 years, we prosecuted crime, and that stayed mostly the same regardless of what party was in power. Sometimes there would be some slight differences in priorities or what types of crimes the administration wanted to go after, how we were going to do our jobs. But for the most part, things didn't change. And there certainly wasn't the idea that attorneys at DOJ were representing the president or enforcing or enacting the president's agenda.
Yeah, I mean, I spent 18 years in DOJ as well, and I was on the civil side, and it was the same thing for us. The work continued from administration to administration. Nobody was accusing us of favoring or disfavoring any particular president because you just do your job. That's what career employees are there to do, right?
Right. That's absolutely right. And there's a lot of doing our jobs that just doesn't have anything to do with the initial next to the name of the president, right? RD doesn't make a difference.
Yep. So back to Mr. Moynihan, he's been charged in New York State under state law. But as I understand it, and again, I've never practiced criminal law, there are statutes, one in particular that seems directly on point, that prohibit threats against members of Congress. Isn't that right?
That's absolutely right. Threatening a member of Congress is a federal crime.
So have any federal charges been brought against Mr. Moynihan yet? And I'm not saying, that question is not to imply that charges won't be brought, but they haven't been brought yet, right?
That's my understanding, just state charges.
And what do you think about the possibility that they will be brought? And, I don't know if you ever prosecuted cases under these relevant statutes, but, what's your understanding about whether there are statutes that apply and whether normally you would expect DOJ to bring charges in a case like this?
Yeah, I think normally you would. You would expect DOJ to bring charges. There are statutes that apply. Like I said, it is definitely a crime to threaten the life of a member of Congress. It's a federal crime to do that. There are also state crimes for making threats. So this is one of those areas where there are going to be state crimes and federal crimes for the same thing. Where you have threats against a member of Congress in a normal world, you would expect that to be investigated by the FBI or some other federal agency. You would expect it to result in federal charges. Beyond that, the significance of this, I'm taking an educated guess, but here are my educated guesses. First, I think that there was an interest in arresting Christopher Moynihan for these threats before the event where House Minority Leader Jeffries spoke earlier this week. I think that in Moynihan's threats, he specifically identified that he was going to take action at an upcoming event where Jeffries was speaking. And I believe that was on Monday. So the effort to get him over the weekend was probably meant to make sure that he didn't go and carry out those threats. There could be a reason why whichever agency is equipped to act fastest would arrest him just to make sure that he doesn't carry out the threats of violence. It is a little bit weird, though, that the state detectives would act or would be able to act faster than FBI. You would think that FBI could act very quickly to respond to something like this. And in fact, I've seen them do that before.
Why is that? Why would you think that the FBI might be more nimble in a case like this?
Well, they have a lot of resources. State police also deal with higher volume. I think that's one of the things that just makes it a little bit harder for them to be as nimble. That the vast majority of crimes that are prosecuted nationwide are state crimes. So the state criminal justice system has more to deal with. State police, state detectives have more to deal with. FBI is able to really focus on cases like this. And when something like this happens, just say, we are going to deal with this right now. We have the resources to do it. So it is concerning to me that there aren't federal charges. There certainly could be federal charges coming, but I could think of a few different reasons why they might not be. One, it's possible that somebody within the administration decided we don't want to charge Christopher Moynihan. He's on our side. That's sort of the most nefarious thing I can think of. I think it's also possible, though less nefarious perhaps, but still problematic, that people in the federal offices that would be responsible for this, the U.S. Attorney's Office and the FBI, don't want the attention from DOJ leadership, right? Like, people know that folks are getting fired for no reason. And if you want to avoid getting fired for no reason, maybe you avoid taking on cases that could draw the attention of the administration. And so normally I would think federal prosecutors would look at this case and think, hey, this is a federal crime. It is more important that the federal government prosecute this than the state government. So we're going to step in and take control. But now it could be that a federal prosecutor thinks, man, if I try to push this case, I put my job at risk because some, nut job on Twitter is going to tweet about me, and then that's going to get somebody's attention, and I'm going to get fired. So it seems like the state's got this one. I'll just sit it out. That's my concern.
Yeah. That makes perfect sense. We've been focusing on pardons of Christopher Moynihan and other January 6th prosecutors, but we've seen pardons of other individuals for very serious crimes that seem to have happened because those individuals are friends of the president or eyes or political supporters. You worked in some really interesting offices at DOJ. You worked in the public integrity section. You worked in the tax division doing criminal work. Some of the crimes are related to cases those two offices handle or would have handled. Can you talk kind of more broadly about what it means when the president pardons individuals for very serious crimes in a selective way? Can you kind of talk about the the broader impacts of that?
Yeah. The kind of historical quote that comes to mind about this effort is, "For my friends, everything. For my enemies, the law." The idea that I've got my friends back. I'm going to support them. I'm going to make sure they don't face consequences. And I'm going to take the law and turn it only against people who I disagree with or are out of favor. The administration loves to claim that what it is doing is responding to weaponization of the department by its political opponents. And so that makes all of this stuff okay. I reject the premise. We weren't weaponized against Trump in earlier years, but even so, right? Like the idea that we get to do this, we get to go after our enemies using the machinery of government takes government and makes its power illegitimate and makes its power corrupt in any sort of normal sense of the term. The thing that I think distinguishes the American system and distinguishes the American government is the idea that our power is derived by following the law. It is not arbitrary. It is not just imposed by somebody because they want to, right? We have a system of rules that we think apply to everyone, and we expect people to abide by them. And what we see from the administration now, I think, is much more like a sort of monarchical or autocratic system where the exercise of power is just because the person in charge wants to. And it doesn't pretend to be legitimate. It doesn't pretend to be based on rules that apply fairly to everybody.
Yeah, I mean, to have meaningful accountability and to maintain the rule of law, you can't decide who gets off and who is held responsible for criminal acts, right? Like that's a basic premise of any democratic system.
Right. And to bring it back to where we started, giving people those pardons, excusing obviously criminal behavior, doing things like dismantling the parts of the Justice Department that would investigate corruption when you are also pardoning people for the corruption that they are taking on, is just giving people permission
Yeah.
to do what they want to do. It's a sort of like broad version of the purge almost. You've got a free day to, do what you want to do.
And Christopher Moynihan's not, back to Jan 6 defendants. Christopher Moynihan's not the first rioter to have apparently likely committed other criminal acts, right? There have been charges against others, haven't there?
That's true. There have been charges against a number of other rioters since January 6th, and for a variety of different criminal conduct. Some like this related to ideology, some just regular crimes of violence.
Right. I mean, I think I read that there was somebody charged with breaking and entering and pointing a gun at a police officer. I think that individual was shot and killed for doing that. And I think there were charges of molestation brought against another one. I mean, these are serious crimes that
Right.
they probably wouldn't have committed had they, been in prison or had possibly had a very serious criminal record. They would have been less likely to commit these crimes. And I would assume that they felt emboldened to go ahead and continue their, criminal actions because they knew that, well, they were pardoned once. They could very easily be pardoned again, right?
Right? I would think so.
So, I mentioned earlier that you were in the public integrity section and the tax division, in addition to the capital siege section, and it's you're one of the few, I think, who worked in three different components of DOJ that have been targeted by this administration. The capital siege section was eliminated, obviously, because we're not pursuing January 6th rioters anymore. Public integrity section was all but eliminated. And that section pursued public corruption. It had roughly, I think, 30 prosecutors. It's down to about 2, I believe. And the tax division, there are plans to eliminate the tax division and, move some of the people there to other components. I mean, the tax division saves our country hundreds of millions, possibly billions of dollars, I would think, by cracking down on tax fraud. I mean, why would we be doing that? So, it's because I have you here and because you have this incredible experience in three different components that have been hit so hard, can you just kind of talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's demoralizing. The work of those parts of justice were to, all broadly speaking, make sure that our system functions well. The tax division, tax fraud prosecutions on the one hand, like, people might find them unpopular because people don't want to pay taxes. But I think, one thing I found working there is that jurors didn't really have a lot of respect for tax fraud defendants. Nobody likes somebody who's cheating. If you are doing your job, if you are participating in the system honestly, somebody who's cheating because they don't want to pay their fair share is infuriating. And
We all pay a lot in taxes, and it's very frustrating when others don't. And
right,
it's extremely frustrating when the government allows others not to because they decide they're not going to prosecute those cases.
right.
So,
And
super
the
for law-abiding individuals, but then the country as a whole, I mean, we lose a lot of money. I mean, it's incentivizing tax cheats to, like, avoid their tax responsibilities, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I prosecuted a lot of cases against people who promoted tax fraud schemes, basically mechanisms to hide income, hide assets. There was absolutely a market for that. And people who were in that subculture absolutely paid attention to what was happening in court, who was getting prosecuted. I mean, you could see that prosecuting a promoter would, sometimes lead some people to just move on to the next scheme, but would sometimes stop them from bringing folks in. Like, a lot of the people who were really harmed by that were people who were looking for a legitimate way to help themselves with a problem. This promoter sold them snake oil. And while they're working with the promoter, their interest is piling up, their penalties are piling up, and they think they're doing something that is actually helping themselves and is going to resolve their problem. Right. So, if all of those people stop paying the promoters and start working with a legitimate accountant and trying to settle up their balances, the government's making money and the system is working better. And the snake oil salesmen are selling less snake oil. Like, that's something that everybody should support.
Right. And just generally, like, our tax system depends on people acting in good faith. I
Yeah.
mean, you don't, the IRS doesn't show up at everybody's door to ensure that they're paying their taxes. You pay your taxes. Many people pay their taxes because, if they don't, they could be prosecuted or, found to have committed civil violations. There has to be some kind of mechanism in place to punish people who don't follow the rules. And when you remove that mechanism, the whole tax system's not going to work, right?
When not following the rules just becomes a cost of doing business, if you're caught and the odds of getting caught get lower, then of course more people are going to stop following the rules.
Yeah. I'll just end by mentioning that you have been very outspoken since leaving the Justice Department, and I really appreciate that. You've been in newspaper articles. You've been on TV talking. You've been in Justice Connection videos. Recently you were on. I think just a day or two ago, you were on CBS News doing a very serious walk. Uh, you know, I'm not sure your walk was quite as serious as my walk or Greg Rosen's walk, but it was a very serious walk, Mike.
I think your walk was more serious too.
My walk was pretty serious. It was pretty scary to other people on the street. But you've been speaking out about what you know a lot about, which is January 6th prosecutions and public corruption and tax crimes. And your voice is very important. It's important that people hear these things from people who did the work. So I want to thank you for that. And I want to just, ask you to talk a little bit about why you've been speaking out and, why you think other DOJ alumni should be speaking out as well.
Yeah, I think it's really important now because DOJ does a lot of work that people don't necessarily understand, nor would I expect them to. There's a lot of judgment that goes into the work. There's a lot of, professional decision making that goes into the work. A lot of stuff that happens, basically under the level that anybody sees. And I remember in one of the job interviews that I sat for one of the positions at DOJ, I was asked about what I thought the most important quality of a prosecutor was. And I said, discretion, right? The ability to exercise good judgment, the ability to be thoughtful, like more than any particular skill. Having that was really critical because we're making important decisions that affect people's lives. Um, I think there are a couple of reasons why, given that, it's important to speak out. One is, I don't think we can trust the people who have been installed in leadership to make good decisions. And I think it's important that people understand that. But I think there's also a misconception sometimes that, you know, law is easy or law is magic, right? It's like a matter of people sort of like having cheat codes to how the world works, or that, law is simpler than it is. I think, honestly, one of the biggest disservices that has been done to the public's understanding of law is the way that Chief Justice Roberts described his job as calling balls and strikes, which is like not a fair description of how any lawyer does their job or how anybody ever exercises like professional judgment or discretion. It's simply ridiculous. And so helping people understand the work better is really critical when the stuff that we do gets to the heart of like how people treat each other fairly, how we exist together in society. How is it fair to use state power or not? And it's especially critical at a time like this when the administration is sometimes just lying about our work.
Thanks for that. I appreciate it. I agree with every word. And Mike, thank you for taking time out of your day to be our first guest on Substack. And I hope you'll join us again. And yeah, get back to work.
All right. Thank you very much, Stacey. It was a pleasure.
Talk to you soon.